Hello, welcome back to a snowy day on campus. A couple of things. First off, you've probably seen that we posted a homework assignment on Canvas. It's a literature review homework assignment on the impact of AI or generative AI on science and scientists. All the details are in the write-up there, so hopefully that will be sufficient. If you have any questions, do ask. You're welcome to use any of these AI tools, including the one that just released today for this. And I'm curious to hear from that experience how it goes. Also, we have two cool papers to read on Thursday this week. So I'm looking for two brave volunteers. So the slides should be on the website, and there's a link to the sign-up sheet in the slides from today. If you go to this doc, please, pick. There's these two papers that I'd like us to discuss on Thursday this week. Pick whichever one you find interesting. I'm looking for just two volunteers, so two is enough. But if you feel like getting a presentation done quickly and out of the way, then this is a perfect opportunity. Teresa. Okay. Please sign up. Do you spell your name with an H without? Do you spell your name with an H or without? Like this? Good. So then one left. A brave volunteer for the other paper for Thursday. The idea is that you read, the lead presenter reads the paper carefully and prepares a presentation for us in class. You could do this however you want. You could make slides if you want or not make slides if you want. I really don't care about the format of the presentation. But I'd like you to walk us through the papers. I left some notes here in the doc for sort of what to focus on. Focus on the higher level study design things and so on. I don't really care about the low level technical details or results necessarily. I care more about the study design, the methods they use, etc. So maybe give a 10, 15-minute presentation in class, something like that, about the paper, summarizing the study, summarizing the study design, maybe a bit of commentary on the methods, if you have some ideas for strengths or weaknesses of the design as they've implemented, stuff like this. And then we'll just have a discussion in class, and I'll highlight a few more bits that I found interesting from the different papers. So the lead presenter essentially prepares a 10 to 15-minute presentation and gives it in class in any format you want. Most people make slides, but I don't care how you do this. You can also just use notes or just put the PDF up on the screen or whatever you'd like to do. I don't care about the format, whatever's easiest for you. But I do want us to, and everybody else, please at least skim the papers. Otherwise, this won't be a productive discussion. You don't maybe have to read in as much detail as the lead presenter, but at the very least, you should have an idea of what was in the paper, and you should have looked at this yourselves at least briefly before. So we'll do that on Thursday, in addition to whatever else we do on Thursday. Okay. So one person is encouraged to sign up for the remaining paper for Thursday. I'll check this again maybe at the end of class today and harass you afterwards if nobody has signed up. Okay. Any questions on this? We'll do some version of this throughout the semester. Probably not every class, but often. We'll have a lot of these papers. They needn't be, this is the list we used a couple of years ago when I last taught the class. They needn't be the same papers. I'm looking at this and I'm seeing if they still make sense, and I'm adding new ones as I find them. For now, just the top two are for sure great things to read, so we can talk about those on Thursday, and you'll see this, updated as we go along, and we'll have more opportunities to sign up and present. To remind you, everybody will present at least once. Maybe some people will present twice, depending on how many we end up having. Okay. All right. Any questions on this? The other bit I wanted to remind you of, in the same deck that's on the website, you will find a link. I think this is also on Canvas, maybe also on the website. There's a link to a Google Drive folder where I park all of the readings for all of the lectures. So if you just want to find them all in one place, you can find them all in this one Drive folder. They should all be there. This includes the actual papers we're discussing. So, for example, in the Lit Review folder here, you will find the 2 papers I assigned for next Thursday, for example, but also include some of the methodological readings that I base the lectures on. So these are the kinds of things that I've encouraged you before to actually read. Instead of listening to me or something, read the actual original sources that are always better than the lecture I'm able to give here. More complete, etc., more detailed. And you've probably seen this already. The way the website works is we have a page for every one of these topics, and I have some commentary and some pointers to the actual readings that I would like you to look at. I'm not going to quiz you on these, I think, but I do strongly encourage you to actually look at the original sources, more so than just my lecture, which will be, I think, often incomplete. Okay. Any other administrative issues?
Are you going to be adding papers to that, or is that just papers that you try
and do you mean the ones for reading in class, or the?
I want to drive. Miss anything in 3 weeks.
I may add things to this. One thing you could do is add this drive to your drive so that it can sync, for example. So then you will always get the updates. Otherwise, I can let you know when I've added something else. Also, all of this, there's nothing here that you can find on your own. All of this you can find online or through the CMU library or however else. I just put them all in one place for myself to make it easier for me to find them. So I don't have to search for them. You're welcome to reuse my organization system here or do something else that makes sense for you. Okay? Good. All right. So today, I'd like to talk a bit about lit reviews because we released the homework yesterday, and depending on how much time we have, we'll talk a bit about the role of theory towards the end. So, okay. Of these readings, the first one is, I think, 2-page or so paper that is a fantastic thing, super condensed and to the point, no bullshit. Very practical 2-pager on how to write good lit reviews. This will serve you very well in all of the papers and dissertations and whatever else we're writing as a practical guide for how to do this. So strongly encouraged to look at this one piece there. Right. So why do we do lit reviews? Because they help us choose a research problem and they help us formulate research questions. I guess a main thing to ask yourselves is not so much whether something can be studied, lots of things can be studied, but rather whether something should be studied. And this is sort of where a literature review can help with this. In other words, how much, if anything, are you adding to the body of knowledge on some particular topic? And who else besides you and maybe your advisor should care about the results of this work that you're putting in? So actually doing a lit review at the beginning of a research project is, I think, in my opinion, always a better idea than doing one at the end, or certainly better than not doing one at all. By the way, just a side rant. I think a lot of you are familiar with, technical CS software engineering papers. Or other technical CS fields, right? You've probably read lots of these and or written some yourselves. There's often a related work section in kind of technical CS papers. Where is it usually? In your experience, where do you find it? In the paper? Is it sort of the beginning?
Usually before the conclusion.
Okay, yeah.
I've also seen it at the very end sometimes.
Yep.
After introduction, yeah. The second section.
Okay, so this is a personal rant here. Feel free to disagree. The related work section at the end is a hard no. Okay. So like, if I have to first read all about your work, assuming I'm reading linearly, I have to read all about your study before you tell me anything about how your study fits in the broader body of knowledge and why you're maybe doing it and how it relates to the state of knowledge at that time. You have lost me. Like, there's no way I will enjoy reading your paper if you don't motivate by reviewing the literature and placing your contribution in the broader context early on why it is that you're doing the study in the first place. So I really do not like related work sections at the end. I avoid them at all costs. I always do these things at the beginning. It's usually right after the introduction and the papers I write. There's a section on literature review or related work or I don't know, theoretical framework or whatever. Lots of ways in which you can find this. But the point I'm trying to make is that I really want to see this at the beginning because I want to understand how your work fits in the broader context and not as an afterthought, which is how it comes across if you put it at the end, right before the conclusion. So just, end run here. I know there are strong opinions and I know some fields of CS, write almost exclusively related work sections at the end and don't discuss related work that much, outside of that in the paper.
So for people who, the opposite side of it, people who write in the end, what is the rationale behind it? Like, why would it be the end?
Because the reviewers ask for it.
The template will ask for it sometimes. Okay. These sections in this order.
Reviewers ask for it to be in the end.
I've not seen templates that are that prescriptive myself, but I believe you.
I think it's also like if you've seen other papers in this space doing similar things, then you
Yes.
do the same thing.
Yeah.
The rationale I heard is that this is where you go for more information. Now that you've convinced everyone with your amazing results, you want to need more. Also see this.
I mean, yes,
It's not
fair,
but
fair.
I agree with you.
I prefer doing a lit review as motivation for the study you're doing, rather than as oh, by the way, for more information, go there. That's just personal preference. I told you this is a personal rant here. Feel free to disagree with this. If you're my student, you don't have much of a choice, but otherwise, it's a free country.
Like the silver lining in SE technical papers that though the related section behind, many times people cite related work, the introduction, saying this recording, how I do.
Yeah.
So that's like a silver lining.
Yeah, I agree. There's often, yeah.
The other thing I've seen in papers is people usually have like a background section after the introduction and then a related work at the end, where a few really interesting papers related to the research are placed in the background section, and then a more detailed lit review is placed towards the end of the paper.
That's fine, but now you've learned that we don't do that anymore.
Yeah.
So from now on, you will know to put your related work at the beginning of the paper, not at the end. I am aware that this exists. I'm just I'm steering you toward the hopefully better direction. Okay, and Rand. So why do we do lit reviews? We do them to report on what is known about a particular topic. We do them, I think more importantly, to identify what remains unknown. So this is really why I'm insisting that this has to go early before you're doing what you're doing, rather than at the end. Right? It doesn't make sense to essentially motivate why your work fills some knowledge gap after you presented it all. Right? You should do that before you present it, so that I, as a reader, get excited about this gap in the literature that your work is filling, and I read the rest of your paper with excitement and joy and interest, right, and learning more about why you're doing this. Okay. So, right. So another, I guess, side comment here you've maybe seen papers that are pure lit reviews. Is that right? Have you seen them? They're usually very long and they don't have new original contributions, but they just review all of the literature on some topic. There's even this notion of systematic literature review. I'm not going to talk too much about this, except to say that there's a very formal, somewhat rigid, established process for doing these kinds of systematic literature reviews. There's inclusion and exclusion criteria for which papers you consider as part of the scope of your review and which you don't, and how you read them, etc. It's a very lengthy, complicated process to actually do systematic literature reviews, and you end up with this giant thing at the end that I think on the one hand summarizes all this body of knowledge on a particular topic. I find them useful sometimes. On the other hand, identifies what is still unknown about that topic, which is the best part of this. In my experience, writing a good literature review is very hard because it requires a lot of familiarity with the field, so a lot of experience in the field. I often see advisors, PhD advisors, asking their first-year PhD students to do a literature review on some topic as their first project. And that maybe it becomes their first paper or something like this. That's fine, but I can't imagine how a first-year PhD student can ever do a great job producing such a literature review paper, because they don't know enough about the history of that field and the work that's been done in it and all of this. It's very hard, I think, for junior researchers to do a good literature review, especially the systematic kinds. So if you find yourselves in this situation with your advisors, maybe ask them to talk to me or something. I can try to convince them to give you a different project or so. I don't think this is going to be particularly satisfying for you, and I also don't think it's going to be particularly successful because I think it's very hard to do this well. You really have to understand the field, which comes with experience. Okay. Right. I guess as a side effect of doing a literature review, you end up being able to articulate your contributions. This is again another reason why it's good to do this at the beginning of a paper and not at the end. So what is it that your paper is contributing? Is it addressing a new topic? Is it using a new data source or data collection method? Is it adding some new findings to something that's been covered already? Is it extending some existing theory? Is it replicating something that we've seen elsewhere? Whatever it may be, your contribution, you first need to review what others have done before you can articulate what it is that you're adding to this body of knowledge. Okay, so I want to do this hands-on, and I want us to look at a couple of examples, two examples. Two papers here. You can either Google them or you can find them in that Drive folder. There's a link in the slide deck on the website or whatever else. I'd like you to take, I don't know, maybe about 5 minutes per paper, maybe 10 minutes total max, individually, and just read the beginning of these two papers. So the first couple of pages or so up until designing recommenders for Twitter in this one, and first couple of pages here up until methodology and data sources. So this is basically just the introduction to the paper and the lit review sections. I want you to just read these two things now, and as you're reading, maybe take some notes or make some highlights or whatever. Keep track of a few things about these papers. How much do we know about that particular topic of these two papers from the literature at that time? What kinds of questions are these two papers addressing? We talked a lot last time about how to formulate research questions, so maybe reflect a bit on the actual questions. And then focusing on the lit review parts, what is the problem the paper is actually addressing? If you could summarize it in one word or two, what's the problem? What's the actual knowledge gap? Meaning, what did we know about the problem before that paper, and what does the paper add to this body of knowledge? who cares about the results of the study? Super important, right? So see how, if and how the authors mention this, and then just keep note of how the lit review is organized. So I'm going to give you 10 minutes to look at these two papers. I think it shouldn't take more than about 5 minutes each, just the first couple of pages in both. Okay. Okay, let's talk about it. For no particular reason other than I just had it in this order here. Let's start with this one, the Motzkos et al. Paper. So what's the problem? What's the problem that the paper is addressing? How would you summarize the problem?
Compare the open source style software environments with traditional commercial environment standards.
What's the problem? Why is that a problem?
Problem is that what is projects are successful, but we don't know how they are developed.
That's it. That's the problem. The problem is, there's this thing that seems open source development that seems to rival commercial software development in quality, and we have no idea why. So something is happening. We just do not understand why it's happening and how it works. That's the problem, right? What do we know? What do we know from prior work? What's the state of knowledge?
A bunch of papers that talk about the strength of open source and how open source is better because there were papers citing that there are multiple eyes on the code and stuff like that.
Okay, so we know a bit about how open source works. Okay. Is there any reason to expect that it's different, right? So why do we need to study open source software development if we've already studied commercial software development? Maybe it's just more of the same.
Because the way they are developed is
So
maybe
Maybe intuitively, they should not be successful and they still are.
why shouldn't they? It's just more software development. What's so special about open source software development? Andy?
There's significant interpersonal connections and how people communicate. That implies maybe there's a difference in how teams are able to build like a software. They don't have fundamental what we assume that they needed to make it work.
Yeah. So last time we talked a bit about mechanisms and theory and sort of causal relationships, but not just that, also underlying mechanisms behind those causal relationships. Like here, a lot of the argument for this knowledge gap is that a lot of the ingredients that we thought were essential for software development to work around coordination and so forth, a lot of those ingredients are either not present or very different in this environment. Right? So, a priori, right, we have no reason to expect that this would work, because the things that we thought are needed for something like this to work are not present or they're different. Right? So, this creates this puzzle, right? How can it be, right? Like we thought, coordination is necessary for successful, software development, and a bunch of other, ingredients. They have a bunch of things here. Let's see. Right, geographic distribution. We thought people have to, be co-located or something. We thought they need to meet face to face. We thought they need to coordinate, via email or bulletin boards or whatever. Right? We thought these things are necessary for people to be able to build software. And it turns out these things are not present, right, in this new context, or they're very different. And still people are able to build software. How can that be, right? That means our initial understanding of the mechanism for how people build software, right, is at best incomplete, if not wrong, right? Because it does not account for any of these, different things here, right? So there's a gap here, right? They're trying to articulate, to create, not to create, to articulate this knowledge gap, right? About how there's a need, right, to understand this in this open source context because it is fundamentally different from the other places where it has been studied before. And who cares? Like, why do this at all? I mean, yes, it's interesting, it's a puzzle, but who cares? Who cares about the findings?
People who are
Marco?
People who develop open source and people who open source software.
And I would say more broadly than that, people who build software, right? They would care about this because, this is a new, different way to build software. So like anybody who cares about building software would presumably care about understanding why this works, right? Because maybe there's something they can learn, from this. Was there more? Did you have more? Okay. So I extracted a few, basically these are my highlights from these papers as I was reading them. I extracted a few sentences that I think are sort of the key parts of the argument, just as examples of how people make an argument like this. I'm obviously not going to read them to you, but you can read them yourselves, and you've maybe read them already. But so also note, just in terms of writing style, how the authors are very explicit about guiding the readers through their argument here, right? They tell you in the beginning what is fundamentally different and why that matters. They tell you what is most surprising, right? So what you should focus on, what you should be most intrigued by. They walk you through, they hold your hand as they're building this argument, right? So this is good writing, right? Because it's sort of, it guides you through the argument that they're making in a way that makes it easier to follow and harder to misinterpret, right? Right, so they're building this argument around coordination mechanisms and so forth. Right, they're arguing that open source software is of similar quality, right? It shouldn't be. If you believe that coordination mechanisms, as previously studied, are essential to have high quality software, right? You should expect that open source software is crap, and the existence proof of some high quality open source software questions that belief. So you have to figure out why this is the case. Right. So existence proof. There's some existing open source software, Apache, Linux, etc., that have been very successful. Right. So how can that be? Right. And then who cares about the results of the study? Right. Everybody that cares about the economic value of software in general. Okay. Any more thoughts on this? So what about our previous questions here? What kinds of questions, research questions, is the paper asking? And what kind of study was this? Case study, exploratory, very open-ended research questions. They did 2 case studies. Why did they do 2? Why not just do 1?
generalizability.
Yes. Right. So you do 1 case study. You essentially build a theory for why you can still successfully develop software in this different environment from what you observe in this one first case. And so you build theory means you have a bunch of hypotheses about how this works, and then you take those and you inspect them again in a different case, in the second case, and see what still holds and what needs to be refined, right? And in fact, I think they do have a discussion in the paper of some things that they got from the first case study that did not hold in the second, and to sort of talk a bit about how things got refined along the way there. Okay, well, let's look at the second one. What's the story here? And what's the argument? What's the problem?
There is this information stream, like change in how the information is being received by users, and it's hard for them to filter and discover content. And there are third-party applications that solve this problem, but nobody has studied the effectiveness of them scientifically. Hence the thing.
Okay. Any more thoughts on this? Other ways of articulating the problem? Annie?
They were asking how recommenders studies can facilitate information discovery specifically for text training. Services like Twitter.
What's the knowledge gap? Why don't we know this already? What's the gap there? What do we know and what's still unknown?
We know how the recommender systems themselves work and how they have impacts. We don't know if those impacts are affected by how text stream affects the impact.
Right. Yes, I agree. Who cares about the results of this? Why do this at all? Other than, that we can.
Designers or platforms for content discovery like Twitter, and also other information stream designers.
Yeah, of which there were many, right?
Yes.
And emergent ones. This paper was Kai 2010, so it was 16 years ago, right? It's when all of these social media things were starting to emerge, right? So this was coming at a time when this, concept of a newsfeed algorithm was emerging, essentially, right? And that carried over to lots and lots of these social media platforms. By the way, both of these papers, hugely influential, thousands of citations, very, very famous papers, also very well written, I think, which is why I included them. So here's a few annotations I have here. Information streams are becoming increasingly popular, but with this abundance of information comes the scarcity of attention. You need to filter the stream down somehow. One approach is to have a recommender system that recommends interesting content to users to better direct their attention, i.e. the newsfeed algorithm. We've studied recommender systems as a solution to attention scarcity for a long time. Okay, so one quick pause here. Note how so we talked about mechanisms again, right? Note how this is not this argument they're crafting is not about Twitter. Is that what they're studying? Twitter, right? It's not about Twitter. The argument is not about Twitter. The argument is about the mechanisms behind Twitter. Okay, so I tried to make the same argument last time, I think, when I was arguing to test the underlying mechanisms, not the surface level instance where you're observing those. If you're building a tool, for example, which is a common type of research in CS, right? Don't test the tool. We don't really care about it. Test the underlying mechanisms that your tool embodies. Same here, right? This isn't about Twitter, right? Twitter is just a convenient place to study this empirically. This is about these underlying recommender algorithms, newsfeed algorithms. Right? That's really what is the contribution to knowledge here. It's not about Twitter. Twitter is just where we happen to be able to observe this. For whatever reason, it was convenient. The recommender systems have been studied for years. There's some, well-known approach, collaborative filtering, which looks at what your friends have liked or something or read. One problem these things have is the cold start problem. So, what do you do then? You use some other sources of information. There's a wealth of research on those. Recommendations can be generated from explicit social information and social processes as well. Because Twitter has both textual and social information available, meaning you have the actual content of the posts and you have the social network, whatever, things on top of that. You have the relationships between users. Key parts of the work described above may be applicable for a Twitter recommender. So look, they're taking these mechanisms, right, for collaborative filtering here, like using textual information or using social information, right? They're taking these mechanisms that have been studied before in different contexts, and they're combining them here in this new environment where both are present, right? There maybe has not been another environment where this has been studied empirically before, jointly, right? You know, Twitter was at the time maybe the first place where you could combine both textual information and social information to do this kind of newsfeed curation. Right? You know, we knew about the mechanisms; they had been studied before separately. So that's the the underlying generalizable theory behind all of this. Now we have a new empirical domain where we can study them jointly, study their interactions, whatever. So we're going from this higher level theory and understanding of the mechanisms to make predictions or to study in an exploratory fashion how they might manifest in this given context. And so that's the argument here, really. Right, they have not been implemented and evaluated on Twitter, information streams in general. As a result, it's unclear whether these techniques function well, given the differences between the original domains and Twitter, or if some techniques need to be changed to fit the needs of Twitter users. Our work not only depicts the design space for a Twitter recommender, but also better informs designers of recommenders for other information streams. Okay? So that's the argument. So note from these two examples that we looked at, a common pattern in both of them. And this is really the essence of this two-pager I recommended at the beginning of class today. The pattern is that all of these, both of these two papers we looked at, follow this problem, gap, hook structure to craft their argument. First, you articulate what the problem is. Second, you establish that there's a knowledge gap. You review the literature. So this is again why I'm insisting that it's good to do this at the beginning and not at the end. You review what is known about that particular problem, and you articulate, make explicit some things that are not yet known. That's the gap. And then the hook, right? You want to hook your reader, your reviewer. The hook is the who cares part, right? Yeah. Who would care about filling this particular knowledge gap, right? So it's not enough to do something just because you can. I mentioned this earlier. It's not enough to study something just because you can, right? Typically, you have to study something that's important and relevant and of interest to lots of people, etc. Like a substantial enough problem. But it's hard to convince a panel of, say, NSF reviewers to fund your proposal, right? If nobody other than you and your advisor cares about the particular problem you're hoping to study, even if you've identified a valid knowledge gap, right? So you really need this third hook element. You need to argue, right, why this is important. Who cares about this? Who cares about doing this work, about answering these questions? And what's the impact of answering these questions likely going to be, right? What could we do? Who might care about the findings? So I want you to remember this very, I think, intuitive, simple pattern. And the two-pager, again, argues all of this very clearly. For how to craft an argument. You can apply this everywhere. You can apply this in every paper you write. You can apply this in proposals and dissertations and whatever else. It's always the same. It works every time. Right? What's the problem? What's the gap in the knowledge about the problem at the time you're doing this research? And who cares? Right? Why is this important? Who cares about the findings? Right? These three elements. And the more explicit again, good writing is, intuitive. It's easy to follow. It's simple. Like it shouldn't be hidden, right? It should be very obvious, very explicit. What these things are. it should be so clear that, if I would give you this exercise again to identify these things in some example papers, you should be able to do that immediately, right? In a few seconds, you should be able to skim through the introduction or whatever literature review section of a paper and almost instantly be able to identify the problem, the gap, and the hook. Right? If you write it well, it should be super easy to extract these things. So try to write like that, right, to make it super obvious and clear. And I think the two papers are very well written and are good examples. The first one is an easier argument to make, the whatever Apache Mozilla one, because I think there was less known about that topic at the time. It was much easier to argue the gap. You saw in the second paper, the Twitter paper, how it was quite involved technical argument about the types of information sources being used in these recommender systems for collaborative filtering. It's like making that argument was more involved, requires some technical details, etc. It wasn't as easy. Like you're not always in a position to have a very obvious big knowledge gap, right? Because most of the things we work on have a history of research, right, before you end up working on them. But these are two good examples for how to craft arguments, both when there's very little known about a topic as well as when there's a lot of history and you're just adding an increment to that. Right. So this is...
You mentioned the related work section, but all of these, I suppose, we're going to find in the introduction, right? Which goes to Shrey's point that you will have in the introduction the part of the related work that's really fundamental for the readers to understand the gap, right? And then you have the actual related work section, which goes a bit more depth over that.
The way I usually think about this is this kind of related work discussion where you make this argument, problem, gap, hook, is where you list and motivate your research questions.
Mm-hmm.
So every paper should arguably have explicit research questions or something you're asking explicitly. There should be at least one usually. It's not enough to just list it. A good, well-written paper will go to great lengths to motivate why the question is worth asking in the first place. And that motivation is exactly this literature review. Like motivation means you review what is known about the problem, you identify a knowledge gap, which is what your research question tries to fill, and you motivate why the question is important. That's the hook. Like who cares about answering it? So in that sense, usually research questions, when you make them explicit in the paper, they're usually close to the beginning of the paper. Sometimes they're in the introduction itself. Oftentimes they're in a follow-up, section after the introduction. Usually my papers are like this. I think the introduction is kind of a higher level overview and summary of the entire paper. I don't usually name the research questions explicitly in the introduction because I like to build them up. And I just don't have the space in the introduction to do this. So, introduction is usually, for me, a little higher level. This may vary. But I usually have a lengthy literature review or whatever you want to call it. Sometimes I call it explicitly something like, development of research questions or theoretical framework is another term that, people use. You can call it anything. You could call it even related work. Although you're doing more than just reviewing related work, you are reviewing related work. You're making explicit a knowledge gap that then results in your questions, your research questions, which you also make explicit. And as part of the same argument, you also mention why, like what, who cares, right? I'm not asking this question just because there's a knowledge gap, but also because answering it would have important implications for X, Y, and Z. Right? Here are the stakeholders, right, that could potentially benefit from answering this question, right? So it's not just something that's of interest to me and my advisor. It's something that has much broader implications for whatever my field. So it's just not possible to do this at the end, in my view, because like all of this is part of making explicit and motivating your research questions, and you can't do that at the end after you've done the work. Right? You have to start with, what it is that you're doing in the paper.
Yeah, I guess I've seen very few papers framed this way. Usually, I've read a lot of papers that make the research questions explicit in the introduction, and don't have this second section where they, clearly explicit that in conjunction with the history.
That is correct. Most papers are not well written.
Yeah.
That's just a fact. I think it's not. Yeah, most papers are. I mean, assuming some normal distribution of, I don't know, goodness of writing of papers, right? Most papers will be mediocre, right? If that's the case, if that's the distribution, right? There will be, some papers that are super bad, and then there'll be some papers that are really good, and most papers will be somewhere in the middle. So I'm trying to steer you towards the sort of higher end of this distribution of paper quality, I hope.
Like maybe neither of these two papers define who the research question is important for, right? They just imply that it's useful for the open source developer, anybody who builds software and all.
No, I tried to extract the actual verbatim phrases from the papers. So in the Twitter paper, it would be this thing. Our work is important for answering the question, is important for people who work on the Twitter recommender, but also more broadly for designers of recommenders for other information streams. So that's explicit. And then similarly in the other paper, they have something like this. I don't know if I have it here. I don't know if it's as explicit or not, but in any case, if it's not explicit enough, it could be made more explicitly. Also keep in mind that the problem gap hook heuristic appeared much later than this paper. So, it could be a distillation of design patterns for papers rather than a prescriptive thing. Yes.
Yeah, so I actually think that all of these points they are very important for paper, right? Especially for material report.
Yeah.
But I guess my question is that for that, like for yourself, when you're writing a paper, how will you construct each of these points in which section of your paper? So for example, for myself, I can tell like my previous style is more like I put the problem and the hook in the introduction, and I have another section which is completed work to describe the gap. But I'm just wondering, what is your style, and do you have any recommendation?
Yeah, I don't know that there's one recipe here that is, correct or preferable over others. I think there's a lot of variation in, personal style, in sort of community style, or the venues where you publish, they tend to have a style, like, you read papers and you try to copy the way they're organized when you write your own. I don't know that there's there's one way really. I think the elements are important and they have to be made explicit. I've tried to motivate that it's better to do this earlier than later in the paper. But otherwise, how you implement this specifically in your paper, which sections you have or not have and what you call them, I don't know that it matters too much. So, like find something that makes sense for you, or maybe copy a pattern that you see in other papers and you think works well. I don't think this matters that much. I think the elements are important, not really how you name them or where you put them. The papers I write tend to have an introduction, and then they tend to have a separate section where I review literature and motivate the research questions, develop the research questions, or develop hypotheses. Sometimes I don't ask a research question, but rather I elicit a number of hypotheses that I then go and test empirically. But in either case, research questions or hypotheses, I need to motivate these, and that requires this kind of, literature review and articulation of the gap and articulation of importance of, answering it and filling it and so on. So I usually do this in some, maybe second section in a paper. If there's more background or whatnot, there may be one still in between, that people need to before they can understand my study, right? So maybe there's that, maybe there isn't. And then I go into data collection or study design, or I go about how I actually do these methods, right? And then results, discussion, whatever. This is sort of how I usually write these empirical papers. I don't know that it matters too much. Like I think again, the form is not that important. The content is. Okay, good. So with this in mind, go away. But I also don't want Zoom reactions. It's okay. I can live without Zoom reactions. Okay, just while I'm on this very quickly, a couple of things about citations. I don't cite things just to fill up your list of references. Try to, like, sometimes there's multiple papers on the same topic by the same authors. Maybe they have a, I don't know, workshop paper or a conference paper followed by a lengthier journal paper or whatever else. You don't have to cite them all. Maybe cite the most substantial of those. Cite better papers over worse papers. Try to cite papers that are peer-reviewed and published over stuff that you just find on arXiv. And when you do cite stuff that's on arXiv, those things are also often published somewhere else. If that's the case, don't just cite the arXiv version, but rather go and find the published version of the same paper and cite that instead of the arXiv version, right? The version that's been peer-reviewed and published is the one that's authoritative. That's the one you should cite, not the one that's on arXiv. Just the other day, I saw somebody on Twitter mention that they built an AI tool that does exactly this, right? If you give it a list of arXiv citations in like BibTeX format or something, it goes and finds the actual published versions of all those papers and replaces the citations with the right ones, which sounds like a super useful thing to have. So,
Do you know what it's called?
I don't remember what it's called. If I find it, I'll share it. But the point is, preprints on arXiv are of less trustworthiness in principle than the papers that were peer-reviewed and published. Yeah.
Actually, I had a question on that thing only, that the papers which are not published and are just preprints on arXiv, what should be the best practices to cite them? According to you, like, is it necessary we should cite them? Or is it something that because it's not verified work?
If you had asked me this question some years ago, I would have said, ignore all the stuff on arXiv because it's not peer reviewed, so it doesn't matter. But I think the norms have changed drastically in computer science, especially in the more AI-oriented parts of computer science. I think the norm has become to just put stuff on arXiv more than just, wait for peer review and whatnot. So in that case, I would find it probably counterproductive to ignore arXiv. And I would encourage you to, discuss it in your, cite it and discuss it. But I think, distinguish, right? If you go through this process of identifying the published versions of arXiv preprints, right, it'll be obvious from your citations. If you've curated them, it'll be obvious which things are actually peer-reviewed and published. Right, because those you cite the actual, published versions versus random things that are just on arXiv. Okay, and then just some low-level things. When you discuss related work, try to just objectively summarize them. Try not to, over or understate their significance or offend the authors. Right. In this case, in this example here, there's no reason to name the author explicitly. in this negative light. There's no reason to do this. You can make the same argument about this limitation or knowledge gap, without explicitly mentioning the author by name. But do mention authors by name in general when you discuss their papers in detail, as opposed to just like citing them. And then if you include quotations and whatnot verbatim, you can shorten them a bit, but only if you do not change the meaning of the quotations. So don't take stuff out of context to distort the original meaning, but it's okay to shorten things that you quote in your own paper.
I think you have the shortened content inside the book.
No, so I'm saying here,
Or like the braces.
Yeah. So the brace ... thing removes a bunch of stuff that was not essential for the argument, and was including it would not have distorted the meaning here, the intent of the argument. Okay, so any more on this, on interviews? So now you can do this on your own for next week for homework, and try to structure your review in this problem gap hook fashion, or instruct your favorite AI assistant to do that for you, whichever it may be. Okay, so I want to talk a bit about the role of theory. We don't have a lot of time here, but we did already start talking about this last time. We talked about causal relationships and mechanisms behind them and all of this. Talked about drawing hypotheses from a theory and testing them. We talked about building a theory from the ground up if you're maybe a social constructivist. So let's talk a bit more about what we mean by this. So what's a theory in this sort of empirical research context? Theory is very broad. Think of this as a set of constructs and propositions that describe relationships between them. So as broad as that, right? You have some theoretical constructs and you have the relationships between them, and you can make assertions about those, or you can make predictions from them. So, for example, in the open source paper from earlier, there's some coordination theory there that was a key part of their argument. How people need to coordinate, what are the different mechanisms through which people have to coordinate or can coordinate to build software, etc. Right? So coordination theory is sort of one central theory to that argument. In this Twitter second paper we looked at before, theory could be around curating information streams. Theory could be around the different sources of information that could be used for, curating information streams. We talked about text versus social information, right? That's sort of general instances that applied together in this Twitter context, maybe applied separately elsewhere. Like, so if you could imagine, constructs and relationships between them and propositions that articulate these. Right, so what are the characteristics of a theory? What counts as a theory? Well, you define constructs or maybe phenomena. You make assertions about their nature. You make assertions about causal relationships between them. Bonus points if you make assertions about the mechanisms behind those causal relationships, about why those relationships occur. So, the hallmark of a good theory is one that also explains the underlying mechanism behind the phenomenon, not just describes it even in a causal way that allows you to make predictions. We talked about this example of scurvy and vitamin C last time. You could have a theory about how eating oranges helps cure scurvy. It's even in a causal sense. It allows you to make predictions. But a better theory still would be one that describes the underlying mechanism, whatever vitamin C does to cause or prevent this in the first place. Okay, so theories are the building blocks of scientific knowledge. They explain why and how phenomena occur, and they allow us to make predictions. And the more data and empirical evidence we have supporting a theory, the stronger it becomes. So in that sense, I guess it's not possible to prove a theory really in this kind of broad sense, as much as it is failure to disprove it. Right? You can keep testing it, and you could repeatedly fail to disprove it. And the more you've tested it and it held up, the more you can believe it, the stronger it is. But otherwise, it's hard to formally test these kinds of theories about social phenomena and whatnot in a formal sense. So that's usually not possible. Right? This isn't mathematics. This is I don't know, people science. Okay, so again, more on this. What counts as a theory? Most anything. Theories could be descriptive. So just the simplest possible theory you can imagine and or construct yourselves is one that just describes a particular phenomenon, and that's a perfectly valid theory, or characterizes or classifies instances of something, finds patterns in something. You could study something empirically. I don't know, the types of mistakes people make in their literature review sections in research papers. Right? You would characterize all of those. You could study a number of papers empirically, characterize those. That would result in a theory of mistakes that people make when crafting literature reviews. Right? You're describing this phenomenon. It's a perfectly valid theory. You can also see how you can get a bit more sophisticated the closer you get to mechanisms. So you could have explanatory theories that clarify the causal relationships between phenomena or underlying a phenomenon. You could have theories that are predictive, that allow you to make predictions about an outcome in a particular situation and particular context and so forth, and lots in between. They can also have different levels of explanatory power. So you could have grand theories of very abstract phenomena, right? The grander the theory, I guess, by necessity, the more abstract, the broader the phenomena. Like, I don't know, Marxist theories of society would be an example of that. You could have mid-range theories about specific aspects of human interaction. We didn't talk about signaling theory yet, but I think it's in one of the readings for Thursday. Coordination theory we talked about in this context of open source software development and others like that. You could even have micro theories that focus on individual level phenomena. So it's really not about I guess explanatory power or a level of abstraction here. Right. So I guess one point here is let's say you're this objectivist deductive researcher that is doing an empirical study on testing some hypotheses about some phenomenon. Those hypotheses you have to draw from some theories somewhere. How do you do this? Where do you find these? So in the Twitter newsfeed curation paper, they argued that there are two ingredients to their argument, to their system. One was using textual information. The other one was using social information. Like, imagine these are two different theories that they're drawing from. Similarly, we'll see actually one of the Thursday papers, more examples of this. Like, where do you get these from is the question. How do you find these? Like, how do you know where to start? And disappointingly, the answer is I simply do not know. There is no single theory that applies to your particular phenomenon. There could be multiple theories that describe any particular phenomenon. But all of these things have to do with humans in software engineering, which is where I've done a lot of research in the past. There's lots of theories that can apply to humans in software engineering. There's theories about humans in all domains of science. Humans have been studied, in sociology, they've been studied in psychology, they've been studied in economics, etc. There's all kinds of things that we know about how humans interact and work together and whatnot. That could allow us to make predictions about how they build software, right? So there's no single source of theories for your particular context or domain. And I really don't know how you find them, except that hopefully your advisor has some wider, broader knowledge of things in your area, and they can point you in good directions. Or maybe your favorite chatbot can point you these days in a good direction. Or otherwise, you just read broadly and you see, you think about what applies, in your context. A lot of the work that I have done in my group has pulled in theories from who knows where. We've used signaling theory a lot. I can talk about this more separately. We have used a number of other theories. We've used information diffusion theories. We've used other things and applied those to software engineers in a software development context. There's no one source of this kind of theory. Just, I guess the advice is read broadly and keep an open mind. You'll usually not find these in your niche research areas where you do most of your technical work. You'll usually find these by reading more broadly. I do not want pop-ups. Okay, so yeah, how do different types of researchers use theories? Positivists like theories that have strong predictive power because it allows them to draw hypotheses and test them. Constructivists like theories that strengthen their understanding of a complex situation, even if they don't generalize and they don't have strong predictive power in other scenarios. Right, coming back to positivists, often you end up looking for testable hypotheses that are drawn from a theory that describe maybe the cause and effect relationship that you're looking to examine. And these are what forms the basis for your particular empirical study. They drive what things you measure and so on. Okay. On the same subject, hypotheses here, or theories, hypotheses are instantiations of a broader theory. They have to be testable. If they're not testable, that won't be useful, but you have to be able to test them empirically. And they have to be falsifiable. So side note here, your mileage with your particular PhD advisors may vary, but there are some faculty in our department, at least, that are very particular about thesis statements in your PhD thesis. And such faculty members expect that your thesis statement in your PhD proposal or thesis is A, falsifiable, and B, testable. So that will be an interesting forcing function when you're at that stage to articulate such a falsifiable, testable thesis statement for your thesis. So let me stop here. We have a bit more to talk about, but we can continue this on Thursday. Last thing I want to do is double check if anybody signed up for the second paper and ask you to volunteer. Or rather, the first paper. I need another speaker to volunteer to present a paper on Thursday. Please.
I would do it, but I'm not on Thursday.
Hopefully there's enough of us here that somebody can do this.